Mr. Langer.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here, Madam Chairwoman, and Ranking Member Snow, especially thank you as well for inviting me. My name is Andrew Langer. I'm president of the Institute for Liberty. We are a 501c4 advocacy organization based here in Washington, D.C., and we focus on the impacts of the federal regulatory state on small business. I've been working on these issues for almost my entire career in D.C., first working with an environmental attorney on the impact of environmental regulations on jobs, and then working for the National Federation of Independent Business, as you said. This is a serious problem, and I always get buoyed when I come before a body such as this and hear advocates like you really fully understand what we're facing here. One of the issues that I've found in the last 2 years as our economy has slipped into the doldrums is that folks simply do not understand the role that regulations have played in where we are today. A couple of weeks ago, I debated a gentleman, pundit from CNN, who completely dismissed the idea that the $1.75 trillion regulatory state has any impact whatsoever on our ability to create jobs. But as you so adequately said earlier, the fact that if we offer some meager tax credit to a small business, it gets dwarfed by the $11,000, $10,600 cost that's out there. For a business with 10 employees, it's $106,000 every year that goes out the door. And we talk about money, and that is important. I also talk about time, as was referenced earlier on. We have to be focusing on the issue of time management and the impact that agencies put on, the mandates that agencies put on individuals in how they deal with things. Frequently, we can talk about $1.75 trillion or the $10,600 number, but we also need to be thinking about the fact that every 7.5 hours that an agency puts on a small business owner's time is a full day's worth. And with any, in any business, it's between 200 and 250 days per year that they can get out of their employees. Every day that's lost is 0.5% of that employee's productive time. So when we're talking about tax burdens, and we're talking about 3 to 5 hours, that's a half a day of somebody's time that they're not spending being productive in their business. And so it's one of the things that we've recommended at the Institute for Liberty, and I've recommended while I was at NFIB, that we need to get the agencies to start discussing burden not just in terms of monetary value, but in terms of time as well. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. This issue of cutting regulatory costs, as I said, cannot be ignored. If we cut regulatory costs by 30%, we can save the economy roughly $600 billion, which is the rough equivalent of the first stimulus package that was passed by Congress and signed by the President. Without spending a dime of federal taxpayer money, we inject the economy with an influx of capital, of time, and of energy. That translates into jobs. You save a business $30,000. If they're spending $106,000, $30,000 that they save is the equivalent of hiring one person with benefits. And when you do the math, saving that $600 billion for small businesses means that we could virtually wipe out the unemployment rate in America today. We have to take the steps to do that. One of the things that was discussed in the first panel is this issue of regulatory budgeting. The role that Congress must play in dealing with these issues. I think that's absolutely essential that Congress steps forward and begins to do some sort of an assessment of the impact of the new mandates that they're putting out there. Because it does start that way. And you were very right in your introductory remarks, Senator, when you said that this didn't start with this administration. It was accelerated. It has been accelerated by a tremendous amount in the last 18 months. But it did start 35 years ago. We can actually chart directly the evisceration of America's manufacturing sector with the rise of the 3 great regulatory regimes in the early part of the 1970s. This is going to take a long time to undo, but we have to start today. The fact is that over the last decade, regulatory costs grew by about 10% every 5 years or so. That cost skyrocketed in the last 5 years to went up 37%, from $7,700 per employee per year to $10,600. One of the things we have to get a handle on, and I'll say this in sort of my conclusory remarks, is we have to get a handle on the indirect impact that regulations have. S 3024 was a great step in the right direction, and to build on that, we have to get at this issue of indirect economic costs. Senator, in your home state of Louisiana, one of the things that would have been very, very helpful, I think, over the last year would be how the impact of the offshore drilling moratorium didn't just impact the oil industry, but impacted the small businesses in your state, and frankly, small businesses all around the country. Because the fact is that one of the things that drove this economy under wasn't just the burst of the housing bubble, but it was the run-up in energy prices 2 years ago that small businesses couldn't face. The fact is, I'm wrapping up right now. I just want to say the bottom line is that that offices like the Office of Advocacy have to be protected by this body. They do essential work. I think, unfortunately, that there are folks in the administration who simply don't place an emphasis on the regulatory burden. That needs to stop.
Thank you, Mr. Langer. I appreciate it. Very articulate. Mr. Langer?
Well, here's what we know. We know that for small businesses, that 20 employee number is, in terms of regulatory burden, seems to be what changes things. That you get above 20 employees, the regulatory costs drop by about a third to 50%, depending on what industry you're in and what you're doing. We know that most businesses hire their first full-time regulatory professional at about 35 employees, and that generally has to do with employee benefits, HR rules that are out there. And again, this changes depending on the industry you're in. From an environmental health and safety standpoint, which is where you're going to run into your biggest pushback on a blanket employee size model, you have a number of environmental regulations which don't get triggered until you hit above 10 employees. So you might be able to get covered in terms of that if you wanted to do a blanket prohibition. It's one of these things where we have to recognize that there may have to be a sliding scale given the economic state of the nation. That when unemployment rises above a certain level and economic growth drops below a certain level, we need to relax the rules that impact small businesses. Wealthier nations are able to better protect their environmental health and safety, and as nations grow less wealthy, they have to prioritize jobs over the environment. I think we have to recognize that's a fundamental economic truth. In principle, I think it's a very interesting idea. I think the implementation is where the devil's going to be in the details.
Mr. Gott, prepare for speech on this. If you'd send me a few of those sentences, it might help. I'll put them in charts, put them up on the Senate floor. We'll have a little fun with that. Go ahead, Mr. Langer.
Yeah, one of the things that I've always heard a lot about was when the Department of Commerce puts out their economic census forms, which is sort of a restatement of what your business is up to. It goes along with the authority that Commerce has to collect the census data. Most business owners don't understand why they're having to fill out this stuff that they've already filled out before when they fill out their tax forms, especially now that the mandates are increasing. So that's one that hits a lot of different industries. The problem has always been that there isn't a silver bullet, that it's all the little mandates that add up to very, very big things, which is why we've been so outspoken about getting the agencies to state burden both in dollar terms and in time terms, and maybe setting some restrictions on the agencies in terms of their ability to add further burden without taking burden away elsewhere. Well, to gin onto what James said, that's why we've also advocated for this issue of comparative risk assessment, which I know sort of folks' eyes glaze over. But it's a way of prioritizing public policy problems to ensure that they're actually problems. Why would we spend all of this enormous time and money dealing with something that isn't actually posing a risk to the public, not just on health and safety, but on other issues as well, financial issues, consumer products, which is a health and safety issue. But these are areas where we actually have to sit down and assess, really have a look before you leap, as James said, really understand what we're doing beforehand so that we're not about to cause $100 billion worth of damage to the economy. It really is essential, but really the things that you've laid out, especially for the future, and the deference that needs to be accorded to the Office of Advocacy, that can only be of enormous benefit to small businesses.
Mr. Nance, preparing to be an aggressive advocate on behalf of small business, dealing with that immediately.
First of all, I'll go first.
Either any
all right. Well, I think first of all, just on the issue of the Office of Advocacy, somebody mentioned earlier this issue as to whether or not advocacy is fully funded and getting the resources. I'm not entirely certain that they are, and I really think that the Small Business Committee needs to make sure that they're getting their due in terms of being able to do their jobs and not being undercut by other elements of the administration, which I've been hearing very, very serious rumors that other agencies, other personnel are not giving them their due, and they need to be accorded the deference. The fact is that yeah, the issue of regulation by guidance is a very serious one. And I fear that the more that we try to ratchet down on the actual administrative regulatory process under the APA, that they're going to turn around and start doing more regulation by guidance. The wetlands manuals over at the EPA, for instance, which have huge force and effect over hundreds of millions of acres across the country, huge impact on businesses and individuals. That's not subject to this. And as we talk about it with the independent agencies as well, those need to come under the rubric. These are all things that need to happen. I've always been a fan, if we're talking about real sort of concrete solutions, I'm a big fan of making every bureaucrat who puts out a new regulation to put their name and direct dial office phone number on every piece of paper that comes out. Thank you. Listen, I think if you want to get at it, you want to get clean language regulations, and these folks don't want to get hassled by folks having to pick up the phone and call Washington, make somebody put their name on the regulation they put out there.
Put the president's cell phone number out.
Not advocating for that.
If I might add too, I